I'm Mark Seifter.
And I'm Linda Zayas Palmer.
And this is Arcane Mark. Welcome, everyone, to Arcane Mark.
Arcane Mark.
On today's episode, we were talking about design diaries, designing for different numbers of players. So this is a topic that it might seem obvious that, oh yeah, you just make the game scalable for different numbers of players. But in a lot of cases, you need to make some pretty significantly different decisions when you're designing for different numbers of players. And if you make a game that you think can be scaled up and down by a large amount, there may be a lot of factors that in your tabletop RPG will influence what the GM can do or what the GM has to take into account for when you scale your game up and down that they wouldn't necessarily have to when you're in your sort of sweet spot that you designed for originally.
So, for example, if you're playing a game that is designed for a baseline of around 4 players, like a Pathfinder style game, and then you take it down and you say, okay, well, what happens if you have only 2 players? If each player has only 1 character, suddenly that party is incredibly fragile and not particularly versatile. So the kinds of challenges that they can face are going to be different for that reason.
And here's the thing. Yeah. Not only are they fragile, which is to say, there's a lot fewer of them. Not only have they lost versatility, but it's much worse than the fact that they've lost half of 4 people. Because even if they somehow didn't lose the versatility, maybe you buffed them up and you gave them more versatility.
But if one of them
you're making
drops,
them face half the things, but yes.
Then they've lost half of their capacity again.
The problem is that the way that action economy works in the game, that's exactly right, Linda, is that you get the death spiral. There's no hit point death spiral in Pathfinder 2, or many tabletop RPGs don't have one, where you take penalties when your hit points are lower. But your party sort of does have a hit point death spiral. Your party's hit points are the number of people that are active, and you lose a percentage of your actions that is based on the number of people who have fallen down. And it could be worse than that in some ways, because you could lose additional actions to bring them back up, or permanently lose the actions if they stay out of the fight.
That also means they're a lot more vulnerable to the types of swings that happen if, there's a critical hit or a critical failure that happens.
That's right. So it's a big problem, because you critically fail and get incapacitated. That's half the people down. What if you get dropped to 0 hit points and you're dying? Let's say you've added so much versatility that everybody can do everything. And so whoever's left definitely can heal you.
But then, does that mean they're spending basically their entire turn, the only turn of the party, to bring you back up?
And at that point, the enemies now all get another free turn. Whereas in a party with 4 people, you go down, somebody heals you. There's still 2 other people doing stuff. Maybe they'll drop one of the enemies to also make the action economy equalize. So it's definitely a big deal when you design a game for a different number of players. And Pathfinder 2e was not designed optimized for 1 player. That is to say, the GM playing with themselves, where they also are the only person who's there. That's a solo game. 2 players, which is the GM and 1 player who's not the GM. Or even 3, which is the GM and 2 players, like Linda said. It was not designed sort of based around that paradigm as being a major thing. You could absolutely play them. It works actually really well in some cases, especially if you give extra characters into the party.
If you give extra characters into the party, then it works, because then you get rid of that particular issue. As long as you then make sure that, for example, players are comfortable managing multiple characters.
Correct.
And you have a good sense of, if there are GM controlled NPCs that are in the party, how your group wants to manage that. Then there's the opposite end of the scale from the Pathfinder perspective and similar game perspective of, what happens when you have a ton of players. So, for example, let's say that you have a table with 8 players. The higher your player count gets, then you start getting into things like how much playtime does each player have? How much spotlight do they have? Are you going to have situations where a combat begins and whoever rolls low in initiative is going to, like, the combat's going to be done before their first turn? Or, there's a lot of there's so many creatures on the battle map that because there are more characters, you can't just like say let's consolidate all of that XP into one behemoth, because then you're going to get something that's too hard and it's just going to be taking everyone down. That means that more PCs also means more opponents, and your combats are going to take a really, really long time.
And you know what? 8, maybe you can deal with it.
We've done sometimes that, well, because we've had games where we have, like, we might have a campaign that has 8 players, and usually 8 people don't show up, and when they do, it's fine. But yes, like most of the time, it's smaller. But
8,
like
maybe you can deal with it. Mm-hmm. But if you have 16 or 20 people, and you're trying to do one session of Pathfinder 2 or Dungeons and Dragons or some of these other games, mm-hmm, like 8 is already a GM and 7 players is 8. 7 other players, or 9 would be a GM.
Oh yeah,
and 8
sorry,
I was
talking about 9.
Like
GM
those
players,
are both pushing it. Mm-hmm. But if you have like 16 to 20 total people in your game, then that is just an absurd amount. When you're at 8 to 9 with a GM and 7 to 8 players, mm-hmm, like the game's overall mechanics probably work. Probably. However, you definitely don't want to be throwing like a level +5 monster, which is what the XP table would say a solo should be, like, ever, mm-hmm, against that group, because it's just so weirdly imbalanced in the action economy. So you're definitely going to have more enemies every time with 8 players, which definitely means area of effect, mm-hmm, is going to be more effective. But with like 20, not only is there not enough time, like, mm-hmm, Linda said, and not enough spotlight, that's a huge issue even with 8. But
the game would fracture in half.
The game would fracture in half because there's just so many of everything, mm-hmm, that area effect is king. And it's just like, oh yeah, you know what? This encounter against these 1 GM and 20 PCs, it said I make 19 equal level enemies. Mm-hmm. And okay, and they all had a big AoE that they were immune to. And they, after enough of those, like, the PCs are going to be down unless the PCs also had a huge amount of AoE healing. Mm-hmm. Which they might not have had. There could have been, like, a clump somewhere in the initiative with, like, where 5 of those enemies go kind of near each other, and the only PC in between them can't necessarily AoE heal, where, mm-hmm, like, almost everybody dies during that time. It's
like the problem with batch initiative, but you're basically guaranteed to have it.
Exactly.
And then another issue that you have is that, Pathfinder and similar games are like, tactical games that require coordination among the players, and you can't, and like, it's one thing to coordinate among like a typical size group, but if you have like, 15, 20 people, you're not going to be able to like formulate a strategy. And there's always going to be people who are like, oh, well, I want to drop a fireball on these things over there, but like, is everyone going to agree to that strategy? Like, you're just going to get completely bogged down.
Whereas the enemies might be immune to their own AoE. Or it's worse, like if it's like Hellhounds, mm-hmm, at least their AoE is small, so it won't hit all 20 people, but Hellhounds get their AoE back if they are in each other's AoE. So, like, mm-hmm, if you have something like that with a larger style AoE,
and the enemies, messy. Yeah, can be very effective with their AoEs then in taking down the PCs. So it just doesn't work at that point. So like, what kinds of, I guess maybe we could talk about the super high number first, in terms of like what kinds of games what makes a game work for a very high number of players.
So when you're talking about games that have been designed for a very large number of players, you're generally talking about a game that allows for multiple GMs, or for a resolution that the players can figure out on their own when the GM's not there. And it has a larger play space with multiple rooms. Sometimes the rooms even correspond to like where the person is, to be like, go to this room if you went out into the woods or something like that. Or it's just a breakout room for when groups are doing separate things. And people, when you have 20 players, usually you'll want, regardless of your system, people who have multiple goals and have a reason to split off. Maybe the players are the only people doing anything and so therefore some of them are the antagonists. And they split off to different rooms, either bringing a GM with them each time to help adjudicate things, or doing it on their own. Perhaps like the GM prepared like a packet of information. So let's say you have one room that's like, this is where people are going with the woods, and the GM, because you only have one in this case, has like put a thing down in the woods that's like called like exploring the woods. So you can go there if you want to be in the woods to have like a secret meeting, and you don't have to go to that packet. But if you're like, no, I'm gonna spend an hour exploring the woods, then you can look at the packet. It might say, you know, like roll if your character has this much in survival, turn to this page in this pamphlet. If it's this much, turn to that page, and if it's the low one, actually turns to a page that says you get lost in the woods.
So you could have like sort of that pre-prepared like choose your own adventure style thing. Another thing that this makes me think of as well, you know, is interactive. If you have multiple GMs, it's sort of the interactive special format where
Correct.
you have a unified story, but many GMs are working together to present it to players at the same time.
Yes, and it might not be that everyone is doing the same thing, more like an interactive special, but exactly.
But you can having multiple GMs and sort of someone who is a coordinator or a group of one or more coordinators who are responsible for bringing that information together. I mean, and it would be entirely possible to have an interactive style event where, you know, there are more differences between what the different groups are doing. It's just the constraints are production time, really. But that doesn't mean that you couldn't generate something like that.
For your home game, you could. And you could do it with Pathfinder. But by splitting groups off within tables, and you can allow them in this hypothetical one to swap to different tables, essentially by going to the different rooms or areas that you have with the different GMs, and there's a lot of possibilities.
So there's a few things that are going on here. There's the ability for many players to simultaneously take actions and do things.
Yes.
And there is the removal of the need for people to coordinate and share information on a broad scale.
Right.
So if you see like a lot of other games, you know, I'm thinking about like, you know, Lice Water, which you can play up to 100 people, where it's like, you know, everybody, wasn't that the one where like you pick which one is the false thing? Like everybody can pick everybody, and you can play it to 100 people because everybody just can simultaneously pick on their phone what it is.
Yes. Yeah, it's a Jackbox one.
Yeah, that's the largest like number of players I've ever seen listed on a game.
And for a TTRPG, I guess which I was more focused on.
Yeah.
But you could have a large number of players. Like those interactive specials have hundreds of players. And you have to do it by splitting with GMs, or split like the space and split people out so that they're actually in small groups, even if they remix sometimes into different groups. And even for interactive specials for Pathfinder Society, I've seen a time where like one of the players like gets into a dispute because they have an illegal character and just leaves, taking the table that they were in below the minimum size, and so somebody moves from the other table, and it was like spoken of in the overseer as like that one of the groups was in trouble.
They were deserted. Yeah.
There was a deserter, and they were about to be defeated when a hero from another group, when the two groups met up, and like they were able to like cast spells and heal each other because they were meeting in that location. And then one of the people was like, "You guys need help."
Yeah, and then they moved over.
They moved over, even though they were at the lower tier, sub tier by one. So they're like, I'm sturdy, and I think I'm strong enough to survive with you, and you need someone who can help you. And they did survive to the end.
And Mark and I were co-overseeing that special, and that's how we managed the person.
Yep.
In this situation.
And Badum TTV says, realistically, social groups of that size often break into subgroups anyway. It's practically bound to happen. You just have to have things in place to facilitate it. Bingo. And you can do some really interesting things with these gigantic groups that split into subgroups, because you can have plots and schemes going on among some players that like wind up affecting other players, and lots of like sort of emergent gameplay in these larger games. Now, one thing that you may need to consider is so up until this point, I've been saying you could do this theoretically in any system if you have all the GMs. However, you still probably might not want to do it in Pathfinder or even 5e, which has fewer rules than Pathfinder, but it's still like a generally like more rulesy approach. Just because if you have a game where combat takes a certain amount of time, then if combat breaks out in one of those smaller groups, it can wind up desyncing everybody around the one that did combat,
Yeah.
and they just don't come back for a while. And they probably like it's like, why are those people? And they probably should have been back. And in like the time passage of the game, everybody else is kind of waiting for something that may have taken 12 seconds,
But was
but
actually the combat, yeah.
but actually took an hour for only a few people to do. So because of that, you probably want to make a system that is more rules light and allows more like sort of just like talking to people, just simple checks on things, and even combat could just be like resolved in a very simple way, like even down to the idea of like something where it's like, well, when there's a group and you check to see what the combat values are of everybody in that group, and then the monster has a total value, and maybe there's some modifiers where like you're better or worse against that monster, so you have to like divide yours in half or double it because you're an archer and it's a flying monster, so you double it, but your swords person halves theirs, and then you add it up and see if it's higher, and if it's higher, you win against the monster immediately, and you don't even roll. Like, you could even go down to that level of simplicity just to make sure that if combat needs to happen in the story for this giant group that's split into subgroups, that you don't have it just take so long. The way that Pathfinder Society deals with it is that everybody is generally fighting either the same thing, or if not the same thing, then something else at the same time, and even then have to be called, be like, all right, we're moving on, you guys just finish your fights.
Yeah. So then, for that means that you want your system to not put much weight on the combat, because that's not your major focus.
Yes.
Or to have things be, like a simple system that's resolved quickly, and you don't have that much character customization that's based around it.
Your other option is to have complicated combat, but to not have combat until, like, one point where you definitely have it. So it's just like, yeah, you're all on a deserted island with no monsters on it. So assuming that people don't PvP, you won't have combat until this end point where a demon appears, and then, like, all the GMs start running combat with whatever subgroup they have at the time because the army of demons attacks or something like that. You could do that too. So generally, with large numbers of players, you have to start thinking about that. It's break a large problem down into smaller problems. In this case, your large problem is there are too many players, and it'll break itself down as long as you have the infrastructure for it. So what about on the other extreme? What if you're alone? You don't even have a second person. It's just you, one player. Solo game. So in that case, what you're going to probably want is a lot of tables. It doesn't even matter what system you're using. Like, theoretically, in some ways you could use a Pathfinder style system for like resolving some things. You probably, again, when we're talking about different numbers of players, it doesn't have to mean that number of characters. You're the GM, so they're all technically NPCs, I guess. But you can have a party of 4 people, all of which you control.
But tables allow you to introduce randomness and unexpectedness, because like if you're just playing a game and you know exactly what you're gonna run into every time, then there's no such thing as a surprise. You're just like, oh yes, I guess I'll fight. I'll build myself an encounter out of the monster book and run it.
Yeah, be like, okay, that could still be interesting, I guess.
It's good for playtesting and things like that. Yes. But like as far as like having a larger story, being able to have things that surprise you is important.
That's right. So you also probably like political intrigue and like secrets that are revealed are going to be an issue when you're by yourself. So you probably want something like a mega dungeon.
Yeah.
That with some very good dungeon tables, which you can find from like other game systems or in a lot of places.
Mm-hmm.
And then just like as you're exploring the dungeon, you roll on the D100 table to decide what else, like the theme of the next level and what creatures you're finding.
Mm-hmm.
And yes, ultimately you will play the creatures, but you need to make sure that if you're gonna do this, that you're good at like playing the creatures to their like psychologies.
Yeah, which mean you're not going to be too harsh on the players, the heroes, I suppose I'll say, and have them automatically know the heroes' strengths, but you're also not going to have them go soft on the heroes.
That's
So
right.
it can feel like a legitimate challenge.
Yes. And I think that's mostly it's simpler than dealing with the larger set of people, but simpler to tell you about it. Not necessarily simpler to do, although I still think it's simpler to do because coordinating all of those other GMs and
Yeah.
preparing for the larger group is actually very hard.
Well, like there's a simple game that Mark made for us that has like a lot of tables where dungeons are generated room by room along the way. And so like something like that I think would
Yeah,
work
it was
pretty
very
well.
grid based, and
Mhm.
it had random paths out of the room. Although if it ever if the dungeon ever stops, it forces a path to appear that would continue. If because you roll randomly for the
Mhm.
paths. If it makes a path to another room that didn't have a path in that direction, that just means there was a one-way door that you could open from that side.
Mhm.
And then it has like one of 50 different room features that are in there, like about 10% of which are combat, for
Mhm.
example.
And then if you generate a combat, you determine like how hard the combat is and what kind of thing it's against. And so the dungeon doesn't to start with have a story, but then like the GM comes up with a story along the way based on the things that seem to be more prevalent.
Yes. So that's definitely something you can do. And you can do that even in a solo game that you're playing all on your lonesome. Now, let's talk about something that some people may have thought that this was about when we said different number of players, which is low number of characters. Because high number of characters and high number of players
Mm-hmm.
is sort of the same, but sort of not. Like, you theoretically, if you only have 4 players, but for some reason, they've decided to have 5 characters each and you're a party of 20 people. Everything I said about the combat of PF2 not working is true, but there are few enough players that you probably can handle them with one GM.
Mm-hmm.
But when you're playing a game with only you, the GM, and you're controlling 4 characters, it presents its own challenges. But let's say that Linda and I were playing, and we had 2 people, and one of us was the GM, the other one was the player. We only had 1 character, and we outright refused to recruit any NPCs to the party. No. 1 player. 1 player character, no one's going to be helping us. It has to be just one.
Mm-hmm.
That is its own set of challenges that is separate to the GM is doing it, but it's a normal size
Are
party.
you going to assume in this case that we're also saying that this character can't be a class that has a minion?
So, I mean, maybe they could be. Maybe they could be. And that would be probably recommended. But when you're GMing, maybe you could recommend that, but we're designing. So what if we're trying to design a system for that would work with just the 1 character? So what I would say for that is that Pathfinder is not going to be the ideal for that due to the fact that there are a few things you need to take into account. One of which is that when you drop, that's the end. 0 hit points equals either death or you're captured or some very negative consequence.
Yes.
So therefore, because your party doesn't have any kind of interesting attrition-based thing, it's just either I'm totally fine or 1 hit point later, the game is over.
You want the character to have an attrition mechanic.
You might want to have an attrition mechanic for the character. You might want a brand new system that has something like the character maybe has multiple turns, but as their hit points get low, they get tired and they don't get multiple turns.
Mm-hmm.
And the monsters don't get multiple turns ever. Something like that, where your character is just, it's very focused on your character being awesome and what kind of wild things they could do. You could make a hack for PF2 that worked like that, I suppose.
Mm-hmm.
And then the general idea would be that as you get hurt, you lose some of your extra turns.
Yeah, so you might have like hit point thresholds, for example, and then once you top over those thresholds, you lose some degree of power.
That's right. And maybe, like, if you're talking about a mod for PIF2, it would be like you get extra turns and you have something that's akin to 5e's legendary saves, where there's a certain number of times that you actually have to fail against a really bad incapacitating effect before you actually get incapacitated. That's like your heroic resolve. And as your hit points go down, your heroic resolve goes down, and you lose some of your extra actions. So it becomes easier for that enemy to pick you off by a combination of hit points and incapacitating effects than it does.
So in some ways,
just
you
one.
have one character that has the defenses and actions of an entire party. You're still going to want to make sure that that character is incredibly versatile.
Yes.
And because otherwise it's going to be like, well, GM, you can't throw any challenges at them that particular character can't handle.
Also, maybe you don't need heroic resolve because maybe your extra turns bleed off the duration of incapacitating effects faster. So it's like, yeah, I have 4 turns. Oh, I was stunned for 3. All right, that's only going to take my next turn. Paralyzed for 1 full round. Okay, normally that would take all 4, but for me I only actually lose the first one, and then it ends, and then I'm fine.
You would still need to look at what happens on for some incapacitating effects that are like, and you're just out if you're
immediately killed or petrified
or something like that. Yeah, you would probably need to have those.
You could say that like
scale.
You could either create heroic resolve like 5e, or you could be like, okay, in that case, those deal hit point damage that bring me down to the next threshold, and I now have 3 actions.
Yeah,
like there are ways to do this, and you basically want one character that does not have a situation where it goes from full to just the game is over. And there are ways to design the game to do that. What I just suggested is one way. There are other ways. You can have a game where it's way more narrative anyway, and so like failure is more narrative too. That's another way around it. It's a very different one than starting from a rules heavy system. How would you adjust it for one character?
Another thing too is that you're gonna want to have that character have a fair bit of adaptability / rebuild potential, because you know, with a group that's like, hey, you know, we have a lot of people and they have their different strengths and weaknesses and things like that. If we want to do like a more infiltration style story, you can do that even if like one of the characters isn't as good by having others support them in that way. But then like if you have something where it's like, oh yeah, you know, this one character does not have the skill to do this kind of plot, and that means, oh, well, you can never do that kind of plot. Like, you know, whether it's like, you know, I guess it doesn't have to be rebuilding, but like an ability for them to gain access to those different kinds of stories.
Yes. So maybe you have something where your character is collecting holy relics that are like the asterisks from Bravely Default or the crystals from some of the Final Fantasies, and you can slot in 4 of them, and each of them gives you like a set of abilities, and for each of your turns you have to use a different one.
Yeah.
And so then when you're taken out by like, it's like, oh, this effect would petrify you. It actually deactivates one of your relics, and therefore you lose a turn. And so that way you have like a mix of different there's like a reason why you take all of these extra turns. It's because of your holy relics, and you can change it up each day and be like, oh yeah, I actually have 12 of them, but I can only slot in 4.
Yeah, and maybe when you start the campaign, you start with 4 holy relics, and then like one of the things that you gain throughout your explorations is that
maybe
you recover
your quest
these
is
holy
to find them all.
Yeah. And then that, because if you started with that much customizability, you also have to consider the load on the player, right?
Yes.
It may even be that they started with just 2 or something like that, and there's like a starting tutorial thing that's deliberately
where they find the third one.
They find the third one.
The third one is a little easier than, and then once you have the third one, it's a little easier than normal. But or you make the fights a little easier, like kind of like a 3-person party in Pathfinder 2, until they find the 4th one, and that's when they hit their stride after chapter 1, where they find the 4th one. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So there's a lot you can do with this, but you have to think about it as the game designer, and you have to realize the subtler effects of the number of players and characters. Because the easy thing to do if you have only one player is have them play multiple characters, and or the GM plays some characters, and then you add it all up and you make a party.
There's another thing that you'll get no matter how many characters you throw in, if you have only one player and one GM, if there's a problem and the player can't come up with a solution to it, then they don't have like other players to discuss things with.
So they either have to discuss it with an NPC that's controlled by the GM, or like, and even if they just never can think of it, then the NPC may have to come up with it. In which case, it could feel cheap because the GM definitely knew what the right answer was. So the NPC theoretically is always capable of getting the right answer. So that can be rough. It works better if you have a player who always figures everything out.
Yes. But if the player doesn't always figure everything out, then there can be other ways to make that feel, depending upon the way that the player feels about things. Like, when I'm playing a one game with Mark and I'm stuck, sometimes, he's really good at talking things through, where he's not just gonna like give the answer, but he might like ask some questions or things like that can prompt me to think about different ways about the problem.
That's true. Or another good example of this is I have a lot of like weird mysteries and things going on in the Changeling game I'm running with Linda. But some of them that I made pretty obscure, Linda kind of knows what the mystery is and not the answer, but she also knows that for some of them, and one of them that she did solve, that this happened, that because of the fact that narrative arcs are important, like if she actually solved some of these mysteries, it would be bad for the character who has the mystery. Because they're like kind of juggling like a big reveal about themselves that would basically just they're mortgaging their future in a way that is the narrative equivalent of just taking out a credit card to pay for your previous credit card and just constantly juggling that so that they don't have to have a horrible fate happen to them. But then when their mystery is solved, when there's a reveal, everything will crash down on them. And even though the character is like maybe has some nefarious edges to them, and that's why the story is casting them as a villain, Linda really likes
this character a lot.
There have been a previous time where something like that happened to one of the other characters that was in the game, and so it's actually a plot point that Linda hasn't figured that out, and she's probably happier that she didn't.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I have an investigator character who was definitely trying to figure things out and then became indebted to her and having a lot of other things going on, so he's actually not investigating that particular mystery.
Yes, well, you know what? He has bought her claims hook, line, and sinker.
Yes, he has. He totally believes what she said.
That's true. So that's another way to handle it, is to have ones that you kind of know that they're not going to solve, and that sort of drives the plot. And the question is, how many more little hints and things do you have to put in until they solve it? And that leads to tension and interesting dramatic irony for you.
And I think also like making sure that your NPCs have, making sure that your NPCs have their own goals and agencies, so that if like the characters, the characters go to an NPC for assistance in a problem, it's not just like, oh, you're going to press the I win button. There's the question of, what will you pay?
That's right.
What will it cost to have this NPC help you solve this problem? What is their motivation? Are they going to solve it in a way that you would want?
Yes.
Are they going to help you solve it in a way that you want, or are there going to be unintended consequences?
So you have to think about what they're gonna ask for. You have to think about exactly how they offer to help you. So, for example, with the same character from before, offered to help one of Linda's other characters in that game because she needed their help to transport a golden barge to sail up the Nile that was being purchased by some Egyptian issue. And so she went to this NPC who was known to be able to transport things, and was gonna and the other NPC is like, oh yeah, I can transport it, but like you know that like sometimes when you transport something it doesn't get there, but it probably will, and they know that it's going to be magically transported and you're not liable if it doesn't get there, right? And Linda's character's like, that's true. She's like, all right, yeah, sure, I'll transport it for you. And then Linda's character's like, wait a minute, transport me and the barge. Because she realized that it could be an accident where the golden barge doesn't get there, and this NPC just transports it to like herself.
Yes.
And keeps it, and it's like, sorry, I tried to transport
it's like,
it.
well,
just,
if you want me to transport you as well, then it's a
that's
lot
gonna be more expensive because
you have to use
I
more
need to
men
use
do
the
that.
magic of a scene, and I have to use both a prop and an
and
act
it's gonna
and
be
a
harder,
fairy, and so
like,
it's much more difficult, and it's gonna cost a lot more. We're friends, so I would just transport the barge.
And then it's
want.
like,
and then Linda's like, yeah, okay, I need to go with this barge. So that is definitely something that you can make interesting as the GM by making sure the NPCs have their own motivations, and when they offer to help or do something for the characters, they might do it in a way that's best for them if the characters don't negotiate, and make sure to ask specifically for a variant that is exactly what
this
they
is
want.
getting a little more into GM than like design, but
yes,
this is
that
still
is a little more in
but
GM.
this is still something that you can encourage in the materials that you put for your GMs.
Yeah, that's
when you're
true.
making games for smaller numbers.
I think the main thing about designing is going back to what we said before about making sure you have, if it's going to be literally one character, making sure that it's going to be a character that can feel like a party, and that the biggest trap is that you might not realize that having one person with hit points that are just doing fine, and then at 0 they're down, is just a really wonky way to make a combat go.
Yeah. You are
you either have no one who was ever dropped or incapacitated, or the game is over, and there's no sort of in-between realm.
You're still, even if there's not other NPCs that participate in combat, you're still definitely going to want to make sure that there's good social opportunities for that character, because they lose that perspective of being able to talk to others.
Yes. Now, hypothetically, you have that one player who's like, I refuse to bring any other NPCs. I don't want to talk to anyone. I want a big dungeon, and we're just going to fight. And obviously, if you only have one player, another thing that you need to design in the game is and the GM needs to take into account too, is the versatility to cater directly to the whims of that player and the GM, because the GM is not just doing only for the player, not themselves.
So, like, at that point, there's some degree to which you customize your game for players anyway. If there's certain things that are no-go topics or things for your players, for any player, then you don't put them in. Or if there are things that like everybody loves, then you're going to make them more common.
If you have a group of players and everybody is just like, the only thing we like is spiders, so we want a naughty and spiders to be the only thing in the game, then you can do that.
Yeah, but with one player, one person is going to have their own likes and dislikes, then it's just like, oh yeah, well, when Mark and I do one player games, there is a
game with one player,
one GM, then there is a pretty high prevalence of things like leshies in them.
There tend to be leshies so that Linda can enjoy the leshies.
And there tend to be cute things, just in general.
That's true. When I'm running them for Linda, there tend to be cute things. She sometimes adds cute things.
I sometimes add cute things too when I'm running, but he does it more often because he knows that that's what I like.
Linda wants to interact with those cute creatures.
Yes.
And if they're elusive cute creatures, that she can find a way to befriend them by figuring out a way to approach them, and then have them come up to her character. Then she feels a sense of accomplishment.
Look, there's a reason that I'm really down with the whole Eldamon concept. Okay.
Yes. Well, I mean, you played an Eldamon trainer before basically anybody else.
That's true.
Then you barely had enough time to play test it because we haven't done that game again. But,
yes, our home group's been pretty darn busy lately. So.
Yep. But you're the only person who has the Eldamon plushies to take out for your Eldamon.
That's true.
Because the others haven't shipped in yet. So, yeah, basically, this is what you need to consider. These kind of things when you're designing a tabletop RPG for a small number of players or a large number of players. And we even went into if it's also an incredibly small number of characters, because the players just will not accept having a higher number of character count. I think that covered everything I wanted to say for this topic, but does anybody in chat have any questions that you want to know about designing a game for a very unusual number of players that you wouldn't consider typical for a typical tabletop RPG? And it doesn't look like it for now, So maybe we can say goodbye
Farewell
to
to YouTube.
YouTube.
All right, let's do it.
Bye, YouTube.
Bye.
See you
Thanks
next
for joining
time.
us.